Okay, I want to try and address something that's been giving a few people problems, and that's this idea of the market for loanable funds, which is one of the central concepts of this course, but also a little bit difficult. And it's a little bit difficult for several reasons, but probably most importantly, because we've done it in two ways, right? The market for loanable funds is always a story about real interest rates and investment. And when we first introduced it, we said, look, okay, demand for investment slopes down. Demand for investment slopes down because as firms get lower and lower and lower interest rates, their plans to expand their factories, improve their operations, borrow money for business purposes becomes more and more and more attractive. So firms like cheap money to do investment, but savers feel the opposite way, right? Savers, and in particular, when I say savers, I mean public plus private. Savers like high interest rates because the interest rate is the return to saving, right? The real interest rate. And so savers are willing to accept that they're going to have to delay more consumption and save more only if we bribe them with higher interest rates. And so we could say, imagine things happen in the market for loanable funds. For example, right, the government budget deficit goes up. That's something that we've been seeing in recent news. The government is going to spend a lot of money. When the government spends money, the national savings decreases. And when the national savings decreases, we have to invest less, right? Savings is equal to investment. Savings is equal to investment. And so investment falls and interest rates rise, right? When the government borrows a whole bunch of money, what's happening is that money is getting more expensive and people have to pay this higher premium to get money. But we also drew the market for loanable funds in a different way, right? We drew the market for loanable funds, investment, saving, demand for investment, but we also drew it something like this, in a global market. This straight line here, this R star, represents the idea that Canada doesn't have to go it alone. In the left-hand side here, Canada is going solo. It's doing it all itself. Domestic savings is equal to domestic investment. But in the global marketplace, there's another opportunity available to us, and that's borrowing or lending to other people. The way that I've drawn it here, with this high world interest rate, Canadian savers say, look, the rest of the world really, really wants money. I'm going to lend them money, and in exchange, I'm going to get this really, really high interest rate. And that's because Canadian business doesn't want to borrow all that much money, right? They look around and they say interest rates are high, and they can't get a lower interest rate. Right? If we consider this interest rate here of, say, I don't know, 5%, if a business down here tries to get money at 4%, a Canadian saver is not going to give them that money at 4%. They're just going to ship their savings to another country, and those other countries are willing to pay R star. They're willing to pay 5% because that's the interest rate in the rest of the world. Here, in the global market for loanable funds, we've got something different. We have savings minus investment is now equal to net exports. In the previous world, net exports were zero. We were doing it ourselves. There was no rest of world. Now in the global market, there's the opportunity to trade with the rest of the world. And so the way that I've drawn it here is that net exports are positive. Canada's national savings exceeds its demand for investment, and that means that we're exporting, sending funds to the rest of the world, right? Why does that show up as net exports? Well, it's because dollars can't be created from scratch, right? If we are investing in other countries, it must be because we're getting their currency, and the only reason we can be getting their currency on net is if we're getting their currency via trade, right? The idea being that the exchange rate would adjust in the background, but that's the subject of my next video. So here, when the government does the same thing and the deficit starts going up, right? The deficit starts going up, the savings curve shifts, and savings decreases, right? The government here has reduced the national savings. They've shrunk the national savings in the exact same way by spending a bunch of money, and they've reduced the national savings, but notice that investment is unchanged. And investment is unchanged because the interest rate that firms can borrow at is unchanged, right? It's still the same global interest rate because the rest of the world out there is big. What happens instead of investment falling is that our trade surplus is falling, right? You can see that domestic savings is getting closer to domestic investment, and so as savings falls, net exports falls as well. These are the two really black and white stark visions of the world. On the left-hand side, we have Canada doing it itself. On the right-hand side, we have the perfectly open global market where we can import or export unlimited quantities of capital at the prevailing world interest rate, R*. In the real world, neither of these is exactly true. The answer is a shade of gray somewhere in the middle. But if you're thinking about a big country like the US, you're thinking more like the left-hand side. And if you're thinking a small economy that's generally open to trade and finance, like Canada, you're thinking about the right-hand side.